This is Fan Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Barry LaBov. How you doing tonight?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Welcome to the Fan Electric Ghost podcast. We want to tell people that we are a featured podcast on the Newsly Network. You can see that little icon says "Listen on Newsly," and if you use that coupon code Ghost, you can check that out for 1 month. We will be on Newsly with this episode later tonight, and so you can check that out. We do have your URL www.barrylabov.com, and that will be fully clickable. You don't have to remember that, but it will be up during the show. And we're going to talk today about the primary subject, but we'll probably talk about a lot of other things. Discovering your brand's uniqueness to win hearts and minds and market share is kind of like an overall subject, but we're going to tell your story as well. So once we start with that, the first thing I usually ask a guest is, why do you do what you do and what motivates you?
Well, I was prepared for that because I listened to you and I love your podcast. So I've been ready for that. I can sum it all up with one word: inspire. I love to inspire. And that means inspire others with identifying what their talents are. Sometimes it's working with other people to create something. In my old days, I created songs. Today, I'm creating concepts, as an example. I love to inspire. I love to identify the magic in people, in companies, and then celebrate it.
Well, that's a cool process. It seems like it's still rather creative, and being a creative myself, I'm a musician. You can see all my synths behind me, but I'm in my bedroom producer studio. But the idea of creative people, finding other ways to be creative, and is kind of the whole point of this podcast. I've been able to talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of people who are not just we started talking to this musicians, but then we opened up that like the creative spark is in everybody, whether you're a therapist, life coach, shaman, whatever. And like I find that common thread, and that's what I try to do with the show. So seeing that you're actually trying to lift other people or help other people find their niche, right?
Right. And I started out as a musician, and my songs, I want to let you know, sold well under 1 million copies. But I had a band. We backed up John Mellencamp. We had
Oh,
a song on American Bandstand. I had songs published. I led bands for a couple decades. And what I
mm,
did was I not only was involved with other people doing lots of creative stuff, just like you do. I've listened to your music. I have my band's music, out there as well. But the other thing is that it, for better or for worse, it's the way I lead my company. I lead my company like it's a rock band.
that's probably a good idea. 'Cause I think to be, if you think about the creative spark that you asked, like, why not? Like a lot of musicians, I've always like watching all these films that like Frank Zappa talking about like, why not kind of push it? And why not like, and he would go and play a solo different every day because he felt like he's like, why should I just, you know, restrict myself? So I've always been into like expansion or expansive ideas. I think like a lot of times we put ourselves in narrow lanes, and if you really start thinking, if you're a creative person, like if you're a musician, like you write your own song, you're kind of already in that mode. Like, why shouldn't I do that? Maybe you don't have that problem where you might, well, maybe you have an issue, but a lot of people don't feel they have a right to put out their own stuff. They feel like they have to copy, or they're not good enough. It's that kind of not good enough problem.
Well, another thing I think your listeners would relate to as well. I know you would as a musician. A lot of times in a business setting, a family setting, a band setting, there are, let's say you have 5 people in your band. Well, 2 of them write songs, and the other 3 you're not allowed to write. You're not really creative, whatever. The really great bands, the really great moments in music history or any type of creative history, but in bands, many times came from people you did not expect. And as an example, if you like the band Queen, everybody thinks Freddie Mercury wrote every song. He
No,
didn't.
no,
In
yeah,
fact, another one bites the dust, which I believe, other than Bohemian Rhapsody was their number one song, wasn't even written by the two other guys who wrote 80% of the rest of the music. It was written by the bass player. And
yeah,
you gotta, and I knew that. I remember looking at their album cover and go, my gosh, the bass player wrote this. Well, they allowed that in their creativity. They celebrated it. So I believe in how we run our lives and how we run our businesses. Who says, if I'll talk business here, who says your accounting person isn't creative? Who says your client services person isn't creative? Anybody can be creative. A great idea can come from anyone. And I
yeah,
also believe, you know, this as a musician, if you don't allow that, you are robbing yourself of greatness, because your band, your team is only going to perform up to a certain level because they're restricted. I
yeah,
believe anybody can create.
yeah. I think the walls that we put up are kind of, like, I've always been very interested, like you said, in knowing if there's a organization or a group or even a collective of artists that are more willing to entertain kind of that bleeding edge and not just trying to clone, oh, well, this is what gets in the gallery, or this is what gets on the air, or this is the widget that we need to produce because all these other people produce that widget. And the person, you get the Steve Jobs that says, why can't you have a more creative computer? Like, why
Right.
can't you have something that doesn't look like a business machine? That looks like more like an art designer designed it, right? And so, like, if you come out of the left field, like, well, yeah, well, who's going to want that? Like, well, if you don't put it out there, you won't know.
Well, a lot of times creative people or people who are in creative positions, they play it safe and they get very formulaic. I don't know if you know this story because you're a lot younger than me, but I remember this story and it inspired me as a songwriter. My favorite band, the Beatles, who I believe almost everybody in your audience would know, here's
Yeah.
what made them different. And I remember hearing this from a person who knew them, but also then later reading this. And I think your audience should love this. What used to be is you would be in a band way back in the 60s. You'd have one or two hits. They'd throw you out onto the road. You're out playing every night, 6, 7 months in a row. They then say, we're going to put you in the studio. Get in there. You got 2 days. You got to record another album. Now, typically what happened was the guys get into the studio and they go, you remember that hit song we just wrote? Yeah. Okay, let's write another one just like that. And they go, okay. And then remember that country song we did? And it kind of had that thing. Okay, let's write another one like that. And they would then basically copy themselves, send that junk out the door, and get back into the touring. What the Beatles did was different. What happened was, yes, they put an album together in a day. They go out for 6 months. They were then forced back into the studio. And what John Lennon did was he said, hey, everybody, before we begin writing, let's listen to the album we just did. And once we're done with listening to it, 40 minutes, then let's figure out, where do we go next? Where do we
Mhm.
take it next? Instead of how do we regurgitate this thing and shove it out the door.
Yeah. I mean, I heard that story and then I saw a documentary with George Martin, and he was talking about how they were listening to Peter Sellers records and how those records use effects and backward tape loops and overdubs in the studio like an instrument. And he kind of mentioned, George Martin was talking about, like, well, I could record a Beatles like they're in Hamburg, right, playing on tour, or we could actually use the studio like a painter layers like Monet. Like, so they came up with the idea, and the Beatles had been listening to Peter Sellers records, so that also was into the concept of being willing to do something that you can't naturally replicate live. If you start looking at Sergeant Pepper's and Abbey Road, there's stuff on there you can't do live, as a 4-piece band because there's all these layers. There's all these effects and things that you can't do. Now, nowadays you can because we got capabilities. But at that time, if you start throwing all that stuff on, you're not going to actually sound like that. The record's going to sound different than the live show,
Well, also what was interesting,
which is kind of
their
cool.
create yeah, it's really great. Their creativity was so amazing also because they dealt with limitations. So what you just mentioned is right. So on Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that album had orchestra and had so many different effects, but it was recorded on a 4-track. It was 4 different tracks. That's it. So they
Yeah,
had
not
to record the band, bounce it down to 1 or 2 tracks.
it's
Literally on 1 track, you could have the background singing, you could have the guitar solo, you could have a tambourine, and you could have a kid crying in the background. I mean, you didn't
you
know
can keep
what
on
was going
bouncing.
on
Yeah,
there.
you can bounce
Right.
those. Yeah, that was the
Yeah.
old tech. I used to use tape when I first started before
Yep.
digital. I was very much into a Tascam 4-tracker that you could
Yep.
bounce,
Yeah.
and I
Me
would
too.
use
I'd have. Yeah.
sequencers that had
Yeah.
16 tracks coming off a Roland D50, and then
Right.
bring that down, MIDI 16 tracks off a Roland and put down to 1 Tascam track, and then bounce another
Yeah.
layer, and you could layer even on the 4-track if you were using these MIDI instruments that had multiple channels. You could have a lot of stuff, and that was back when like D50s. Um,
Right.
but uh, but yeah, I mean the idea of if anybody knows what we're talking about, but I'm a synthesis, so I go a little crazy. But
Me too.
the idea that you can use like, it's a palette. It's like you can layer like a painter. And I've always been in this idea of sound paintings,
Hmm.
and sound paintings kind of evoke that painter does layers. Well, musicians, you can do layers too, and that's what we've been talking about the last 5 minutes. But the idea that you're not restricted, that part of the thing is restrictions are good. I use Moog synthesizers. They're only monophonic. They're not. They're analog. They're not digital. They can't do samples. It's restricted. That restriction, that limitation actually can breed a lot of creativity because there's only so many things it can do, but there's a lot it can do, but it can't do what a digital synth does. So sometimes your restriction can breed innovation.
Right, but you have to allow that because otherwise it's a problem and a hassle. And what you just described is a goal we all have or should have, which is how do we do something great and not allow any of these so-called challenges or restrictions to stop us, and in some cases allow them to be a springboard to an even better idea.
Yeah, because if you're in business and you've got this like really bleeding edge idea, but the problem is no one's ever seen it. There are no sales numbers, there are no metrics. Nobody knows if it's going to work. So then there's like faith and then determination and hard work to kind of like how are you going to convince anybody to support something that you can't show any evidence that it would be a hit or it would work. And that's like sometimes if you're that entrepreneur, you're like, well, you got to have that kind of belief in yourself that you do have a service or a product or a widget or whatever you're doing that's like you believe in it. And so, how do you build that in people or help people, sustain that?
Yeah, you're right. Well, one thing Steve Jobs did that was bizarre and brilliant, because you just mentioned him a few minutes ago, is he did not look at research in order to determine what he was going to create next. Because his concept was when his people said, "Hey, we're going to do some research with consumers and see what they want with a phone." He said, "Well, forget that." I'm sure he used different but forget that. They don't know what's possible. Let's show them what's possible. And that's what an entrepreneur should do, which is, "Hey, I know you're used to blah, blah, blah. Okay, let me show you what's possible."
Yeah, because that's the imagination, and that's the kind of thing like if it gets back to a music example, you think about Miles Davis
Mm.
and all the different types of jazz. Right, he was like he's in the canon of bebop, and a canon of bebop then goes to fusion, and then he got the kind of moment that Bob Dylan had when he went electric. People were like, "What is that?" Like what happened to Dylan. They were like, he went
Oh,
electric and they were like booing, calling him
Yeah.
Judas, and people were
Mhm.
kind of doing the same thing to Miles initially. He's like, "What is that? That's not that jazz is bebop, and what are you doing?" And so, like, when you get out on that bleeding edge, you might lose some friends. You
Yeah.
might lose some fans but it's like the law of attraction. You're gonna whoever you lose, you might gain a lot of other people. You don't know who you're gonna gain until you let it out the door.
You gain the respect. I'll look at it like this, and people may think we're just riffing on music, but this is about business as much as music. If you look at it, and you've talked about a few really good recording artists that are amazing. If you look at Bruce Springsteen, if he goes on tour, he's selling out every arena. Yeah, he can't keep up the pace. Okay. If you look at Neil Young, who even in his heyday didn't sing that well, but he was all about
Passion.
character and integrity and passion. And that's why he was so irritating to be in a band with the other guys, because he would just say, you know what? I know we're selling millions of records. I don't like what we're doing, so I quit. They go, you
Yeah,
can't
we were
quit.
just
We got too much money coming in. He goes, oh, watch me, I'll quit. But what's interesting is the people who sell out, the bands who sell out, they're playing tiny little clubs. They're playing the casino with the third backup lead singer for them because the other guys have left. There's not that much integrity. But you
Mm,
look at those few people who have said, okay, I'm going to do it the way I think is right. I'm going to make some mistakes, but I'm
yeah.
going to follow my muse or my inspiration, and I'm going to do that. And that's why there are those very, very few and special performers or artists that we follow and we love because they stand up for what they believe in. And by the way, that doesn't mean you think they're always right. You just really admire, like I do, that they do that. You think, okay, this guy or woman has character.
Yeah, it's the character to believe rather they know because we're kind of in this copy culture. And another example, like if you're out there and you want to be an influencer, and then you say, well, cat videos get 1 million views. So I'm gonna go put a cat video with the same 30-second song that everybody else does, and maybe you'll get 1 billion views. But what are you trying to say? Right? You might have just got into the same category of stuff that kind of throwaway, but yeah, you got the views. But is it substantial? Are you actually having an impact? Did you actually say what you wanted to say, or are you just cloning something that everybody's saying? And so the
Well, if
idea, I think, is like what you're saying with Bruce is like he goes and says what he wants to say.
right.
And then law of attraction, people come to him because they know he'll do that.
Well, if he sold out, after he did his Born in the USA album, which was the biggest thing, and he was a sex idol then too. Everybody, all the women are go, oh my God.
His
Okay.
jeans,
What
he's in the blue jeans.
right, the blue jeans thing. Okay. His very next album was recorded on a cassette recorder pretty much by himself. I mean,
Oh, Nebraska.
he completely threw out the momentum that he had because his inspiration was, okay, I'm now going to do something very different without my band, and this is what I'm putting out. And the record company had a coronary,
You hate that.
and he said, that's too bad, but that's what I'm doing. And that's why in the long run, he has his brand, and his brand is incredibly powerful.
Well, it's the word, it's the song. It's kind of like Dylan. If you go back to Dylan's, like it's the song, right?
Mhm.
And it like whatever services the song in the moment of like where that artist's head's at, right?
Right.
So when he wanted to go electric and he wanted to play with the band, that's where his head's at. He doesn't want to be Arlo Guthrie or Woody Guthrie anymore. He
Right.
wanted to do something different. So we went that direction because that's what he was feeling. And
That's
if,
right.
if Bruce is feeling I want to do a lo-fi singer-songwriter kind of record that really has an emotional impact. And I just want that's where my head's at. That's where I love the fact that you get these artists like Neil, like you said, he would just leave Buffalo Springfield, or just leave Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. He's like, yeah, I'm just like my bus is just going to turn the other way, and we're not going to finish the tour because like
Right.
I'm not there. I'm not there. And he's like, to be honest and know when you're not there instead of like phoning it in. Like, if would you really want to see him phone it in, or you want him to really believe in it?
Right. The funny thing with Neil Young is most people think after the Woodstock album, because Crosby, Stills, and Nash became famous because, in part, the Woodstock album. They played at Woodstock. I didn't know this. Neil Young was on stage. He played with them, but they weren't called Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young because Young did not want to be videotaped that day. And he said, I
Yeah, I
don't want
heard.
to be videotaped. Keep me away. And they said, yeah, but it'll just be Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And I think he said some choice words like, good, I don't really care. He followed his inspiration. And I think that's what's important. Again, that's what entrepreneurs who are successful do. And by the way, they still make mistakes, but at least they're
Yeah.
following what they believe in.
Well, it's not that it's going to be perfect. That's I've always been a big believer of like with a happy accident. In my day job, I'm a
Oh, yeah.
software developer,
Yeah.
and I don't know how many times iterations when we design, like you don't see all the mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes actually lead to other projects. We might be working on something and we were supposed to do X, but we found Y, and then we actually Y is better than X, so we'll actually put X on the shelf and go with Y. And because we have this ability within like IT that we're always jumping generations and moving really fast, and technology is always shifting, so we're more willing to accept that kind of entrepreneurial creative kind of artist kind of mindset than maybe some other businesses that are kind of stuck in models where we're trying to create the future. So a lot of times we're in that mindset. But to get to that mindset, it's like what do you have to do? You have to talk to a guru, talk to a life coach, meditate. Where do you how do you start to to catch on that fire? Catch. I don't know.
No, you're right. I call that the perfect trap where people get stuck in trying to make sure everything is perfect and they cannot move. I have a chapter in my book called The Perfect Trap. And exactly what you said is one of the paragraphs, which is some of your favorite songs were actually where the artist misplaced his or her fingers on a fretboard and went, wow, that's really cool. And all of a sudden, that magic is brilliant, but it was a mistake. It was an accident, like you said.
Yeah,
And we have to realize that it's not about perfect. You've got to let that go because if you hold on to perfect, you're not going to have a lot of output. And by the time you finally shove something out the door, the world's changed so much. And I'm talking about songs and I am talking about product launches. By the time you wait and wait for perfect to happen, which it never will, but you finally wait long enough and you ship that thing out the door, it's late.
yeah,
Everybody else
so
is doing that. People have moved on.
yeah, that's a big problem because I've run into it. Like it's a common issue whether you're an artist or a business person. Like you spend so much time, and with a lot of the tools today, you can try to approach the so-called perfection. But I've been always a big purveyor of the, like I said, the happy accident, or like in music, like I like to use multi-tracks rather than DAWs because I'll
Mhm.
go and learn. I use a lot of analog stuff, but I felt like if I put it through the DAW, I'm gonna go and try to change the bars rather than, get on my bass guitar. I'm gonna play that bass line into a multi-track, and it is what it is. And then I'll play the drums, play the keyboard. If you do that, yeah, it might be imperfect. It might be micro timing, microtonal. You hit a different chord, but those, like you said, a lot of times it's the accident that drives that creative process. That there's the misstep or the so-called bad note, but it's really not a bad note.
Mm-mm.
It's like the idea of the bad note. There's a lot of people who say, Herbie Hancock, Miles Davis, tons of artists will say, there's no such thing really as the bad note. It's an opportunity
Mm.
to take that somewhere else. And then like, wow, there's the light goes off. It's like I can actually go this way or that way or the other way or any way I want.
No, you're right.
So it's really interesting in terms of like how you can take that creative spark and bring it into entrepreneurship. And people might not see the linkage between being like an artist and being an entrepreneur. I think they're two different things. One's the artists are like starving artists. They don't know anything about business. So maybe you can kind of talk about that kind of story, like the synergy or the how you were able to connect.
I'd love to. There's a great connection between being an artist, being creative, and following what you believe in. You can call it being an entrepreneur, being a business person. The thing I think is so important is that in business today, and I think it's been like this for a long time, a lot of us feel like, okay, well, it's business. It's not really creative. It's just make a dollar, just make a buck. And that's not what business is for me. So what I do is I look at every client that we work with, and we do what we call an immersion. We immerse ourselves into what they do. And we could go, if they're a manufacturing facility, we could go into their plant or factory. We try to learn what they're doing. And here's what's interesting. We don't try to create what their brand is. We try to discover what their brand is. We try to discover what they're doing that's unique. Because here's another thing. When you're very enthusiastic and filled with passion, you're also very willing to change things and stop doing this or whatever. And so many times, one of the most important things we bring to our clients is we say, hey, you know what? You do this, this, and that really well. And they go, yeah, we don't care. And we go, no, hold on. Don't change that. That's why you are in the position you're in. That's why your customers love you. They love that. And many, many times the customer will say, are you kidding me? It's nothing. And we go, no, it's very important. It's the most important reason why your customers are loyal to you. So we look for those things.
Mhm.
It's very important to find where that magic is with our clients, because many times they've gotten caught up into this commodity mindset where
Mhm.
they have to compete with everybody worldwide. And what does that mean? Lower your price, cut corners,
Mhm. Change things. Yeah.
change
Well,
things. Yeah.
that's the kind of story of the '70s. If you look at like Detroit, their cars in the '60s and the '50s, like, wow, these things are really amazing. And then you start getting into the '70s and they start like skimping and not having the style, and it's kind of boring. And it seems like the bean counters are starting to determine the design, right? Because they're not allowing you to do what they used to do, which is what the customer liked. They liked what they were doing before, but then they said, well, we got to make more profit. We gotta get on these trends. And then if you let people like destroy your brand because they don't understand your brand and they're just trying to make you like service the market, service the shareholders, and yeah, it's fine. You got to make a profit, but if you make a profit to the detriment of your brand identity, then you're probably going to lose it.
That's really well said. We get to work with private equity companies, some great ones, and they'll buy a large corporation. And what they say is, it's a great slogan. They say, we buy a great company on a bad day. So they'll buy a company that has a lot of, possibilities to it, a lot of potential, but they'll get it while that company's kind of in trouble. They'll bail them out. They'll
Mhm.
own it. The biggest challenge for the PE company is to not
Right,
eliminate the
right.
unique differentiators that made that company great. Because these private equity companies, and I love them, I work with them, I love them, some of my best friends are major people at them, but they're great behind the curtain. They're looking at, how do you simplify an operation, how do you reduce waste? Okay, that's great. It's all great until you start to infringe on those very, very few unique things that people love about your brand. And when you start to take those away and you start to smooth out some of those rough edges, sharp edges, all of a sudden you've got a commodity. You have something that's no different than anyone else. And the PE company will then look at themselves and go, why'd we buy this thing? It's a dog. Well, if that happens, it's because you created this dog, and it's not what they wanted, but it's easy to do that because we have to understand, and I think this is important, and it's important in business and everything, including music. Differentiation, which is what I focus my life on, is not synonymous with superiority. You mentioned a Moog. Okay, everybody, that's a synthesizer. Well, there are other synthesizers. I had an ARP Odyssey way back when. I know they still have them. Okay, you can get into a fight with somebody who owns a Moog if you own an ARP, and you can get into a good intention fight over which one's better. Right. And it's the same thing as if you own a Macintosh, if you own a Mac computer versus a PC, you can get into a fight. But the reality is they are different. They have uniqueness. They have certain aspects that appeal to certain groups. Everybody, that is what you want with your brand. You want to have 1, 2, or 3 of those. It does not mean that you are superior. It does mean you are unique. You are doing it a different way for a particular reason. And guess what? There is an audience that is attracted to that. And you have to hold that sacred. You've got to hold on to that thing like it's dear life. You cannot let go of those 1, 2, 3, or 4 unique differentiators that you have.
Yeah, I think what happens is people don't realize, they think, well, everything's the same, and they don't understand, like, it's not that it's superior, like you said, but it's the color. It's like the reason why, if you're, a musician, you pick different types of guitars for the
Exactly.
tones that they have. I mean, I love the ARP 2600. I love the 2500. There's a Quadra. There's a lot of cool ARPs. They have different colors versus like a Mini Moog or a Model 55. They, the CP3 mixer or whatever, the low pass filter. There's certain things that those instruments, even though they're all analog synths, they have their own character. And when you're trying to have a certain color or tone, it's the same reason why you use a Rickenbacker versus like a Les Paul. There's something you're looking for. You're looking for that tone. It's a guitar, but it has a different tone. So if somebody's just looking at high level, it's all good. It's just a guitar. It doesn't matter. It's like, well, the musician's going to know that there is a difference in the tone. No. It's like if you go to a brand and you buy an ice cream company, and everybody bought that ice cream because it was like had a certain taste, and then somebody decides, I'm going to mass produce it and change it, and say, you still have the same label, and they're going to cut the cost. But then when the customer gets it, it's like, but this don't taste like what I like. This is not why I bought this brand. Now it tastes like something that I wasn't really into. And it's like, well, you just because it has the name doesn't mean it's the same thing. It's like you can't wreck that differentiation. If you do, then you lose it.
You're right. And I think here's the challenge that's really, really powerful. Let's say you have a brand, you have a company that you're running, or it could be a rock band or whatever, but it's a brand, it's a company, let's say, and it has some uniqueness, and you name those unique attributes. And what you do, and we really work with our clients to do this 100% of the time, before you promote it to the world, you celebrate it internally with your team so they actually know why we do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
That helps because today we all know it's hard to retain employees. Turnover is very high. Company loyalty from employees can be very low. Well, but they're right. They're right to have no loyalty unless there's a reason to have loyalty. A good example. You're right. You've got to be. I walked through an ambulance factory. One of our clients owns ambulances and manufactures them, and they're great. And walking through the plant, I met with a young man, and I said, "Hey, what do you do?" And he goes, "I plug in wire harnesses." And it was dead silence. And I thought, okay. I go, "What else?" He goes, "I'll tighten a bolt from time to time." And I said, okay. And then he added, but I'm going to leave here for 25 cents an hour. I'm going to go down the road. There's a marshmallow factory, and I can start working over there, and I'll make a few more bucks a week. I said, okay. I said, let's think about this. Each ambulance that your company builds, and you have like a dozen of them going down the line right now, will last about 10 years. And he said, yeah, they'll last 10 years or so. Yeah, maybe longer, but 10. Yeah. I said, in that period of time, over 100,000 people will be in that ambulance, whether it's the driver, the EMT techs, patient, or patient's families. And he said, yeah, okay, 100,000. I said, and every year there are 4,000 accidents that ambulances are in as they're going through intersections. And he goes, oh, yeah. I said, okay, you're saving or protecting the lives of about 100,000 people, which with each one of these that your company builds. And he said, well, I never thought I was in the life-saving business.
Yeah. Wow. They never really got that. Uh, you would have thought that an ambulance company would have had that as a motto, as their kind of company mantra. So to make people want to stay by it. Maybe people are forgetting, like you're saying, they're not thinking that the person's anything other than a number on the assembly line, like a widget coming off the assembly line. If you're not invested and you don't really think out like with the big picture of like where's your product going, who's using it, is it important? Am I important? If you don't think you're really important, then you probably could just leave, because it's like, well, I'm just replaceable. I'm not that critical.
And what you said is exactly the point for your audience. It's not that the company is evil and they're trying to destroy these poor people. Not at all. The company leaders are too close to what they're doing. They see it every day. They don't pay attention to it anymore. When they started the company, they had that passion and they said, we've got to save lives and we're doing this and we're adding this in here so that this will be safer. Okay, they're still doing that in many cases, but they've become comfortably numb, let's say. They've
Yeah.
become too numb to it. And what we have to do at my company, I help, again, remember, inspire. I help inspire them to inspire their people by saying, wait a minute, here's why we do these extra steps to make this safe. Here's why we will not let this pass inspection unless it does this, this, and that. And instead of it being a real pain for that poor employee, they're going, hey, I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So we need to feel that. We need to have a strong understanding of the fact that we have a significance, that what we're doing actually matters, and the company we represent, we work for, we sell, we service, whatever our job is, that company has some real value.
Yeah, you have to become an evangelist again for your like original story, which I think some of the companies have forgotten what their story is, and they haven't really been out there, and they've been so turned into Wall Street and the accountants and all those people are in the everybody in the boardrooms making decisions. It's too much of a narrow lane, and it kind of goes back to this idea, like sometimes you need to cross lanes, sometimes you need to kind of open your eyes and then figure out like what are your workers doing? Like, can you go take a guided tour of your company
Mm.
and check all the roles and see what people do and understand what they do, and then start to do the assessment that you're making. Maybe you have to be a consultant to figure that out because the people are too close to it. So you come in and you do help people start to see. It's like when people say, I had somebody on the podcast one time say they went to decide they were going to buy a car. As soon as they decide to buy that car, then on the road they suddenly see that car.
Right.
So they saw that car. That car was there yesterday, but you didn't see it. It's only that you got an interest in it now that you see it. So I think a lot of times that happens in companies. People, they don't understand the roles of the people. They don't pay attention to it. Something goes
Yeah.
wrong, then they want to talk to the person. Then say, well, if you only talk to them when the something going wrong, then they're probably going to walk out the door.
Well, one thing to keep in mind, like you said, people the people who are making that product have to understand why they're doing it. And you mentioned a car, just as a great example. People do not distinguish the difference between the brand and the experience that they got when they went into the store or the dealer. So, for instance, somebody wants to go buy a certain type of car, they go to the dealership. And let's say it's a terrible experience. The dealer treats the person terribly and they walk off and they go, okay, that was horrible. What do they say? Well, all too often, everybody, they say, I'll never buy that car.
That
I'll
brand.
never say a good thing about that brand. And the people who built that car back in whatever factory or plant, they have nothing to do with
Yeah.
that person who gave a bad experience. But you know what they do have responsibility for? If they are not making sure that the person who represents them way far away, hundreds of miles away, maybe thousands of miles away at a dealership, if that person at that dealership thinks, hey, I'm just selling stuff, I'm pushing it out the door, who cares? Then that brand has lost customers, sales, market share, and people. They've lost it all.
Yeah, it's like the same thing with the CRMs. Like if somebody has an experience with a customer relationship manager and the person doesn't treat them right, and they can't get their problem solved, then the person starts to down the brand. Because every time I go to this brand, I get sent to 5 different people. I never get the answer. I never get it resolved. And they say, "Well, I'm done. I'm out." And it's like it's very important to make sure that your interaction points, like you're saying, whether it's the CRM, it's the salesperson, it's the manager, it's anybody that represents that company in different roles, is like invested in like the passion, the telling the story, like but doing the job, and I'm just not moving a widget. I really believe in it, right? The reason I'm at this dealer because like you think about if somebody, oh, I'm into it because I love 442s or I love Mustangs or I love this or I
Right.
love that. They're passionate about it. Like if you go for a higher end brand, then the person probably going to be really telling that story, trying to sell a Ferrari. They're going to be like very passionate about that Ferrari. They're going to tell you everything about it. Lamborghini, the kind of high end brands. Well, like, well, you don't have to be a high end brand to be kind of an evangelist. Like somebody on Etsy is probably an evangelist for what they're doing. It's passion. It's handmade, crafted. They're passionate about what they do. They probably respond to their customers. They get, if they're a good vendor, then they get repeat customers because people have this really glowing experience that, you bought something custom. I mean, I buy in custom gear, become an electronic musician, and I buy for a lot of small, unique brands. And the difference is like when they actually call you or send
Mm.
you a note or send you a card and they handwrite it or they hand like sign that piece of equipment is actually signed by somebody on the line and said like, and I got a card from like a microphone company, and the person that built it signed this card saying they were the person, they had their name. And I said, well, that's really cool. You know, I just felt more invested because I actually connected to a person.
Well, and what's really important about that is it's that human connection where that person evidently felt that what she or he did was significant, important, and wanted to let you know that they crafted that microphone and they really hope you're happy with it. That that can keep a customer happy for decades.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you want like why people will pay more money. Like if people not, it's not always about the lowest price. Sometimes people are willing. Because my daughter was talking to like she's in a nonprofit thing, and they were doing like tickets for these nonprofit events, and they have these tickets for people who are like founders or people who want to support the brand or
Mhm.
support the cause, and they'll actually kind of pitch it like, well, if you pay more, you can help these people. You can help more people. So the higher price you pay for the ticket actually supports more people, helps us do more. And so you can get people to actually give more if you explain yourself, if you connect them to understanding, like, oh, you're going to help this individual, you're going to get this person to their goal. It's about like the communication. of like, what's your goal? What are you trying to do?
Well, people have to believe and they have to think that their product is really worth, screaming at the top of the mountain for because we're making a difference. And what you described there with the nonprofit is really smart because if they don't believe, then why should you believe? I was introduced, it's just the first few pages of my book. The title of the chapter is would you buy your own product? Okay, that's the title of the first chapter. Would you buy your own product? And what happened was one of my favorite clients had just been brought in to run a company that was over 100 years old. And he said, "Hey, can you get on the phone with my leadership? I kind of want them to meet you and maybe you can help me." And I thought, well, sure. I get on and they're really good people. But the head of sales said, "Yeah, our product's okay, but, we're no better than anyone else and we're not delivering on time." The manufacturing VP said, our our product is okay, but we have a lot of quality problems, lots of quality problems. The engineer said, we used to be cutting edge, but we're way behind the times. And I said, "Guys, listening to all this, it seems to me not one of you would buy your own product." And there was a lot of silence. And the leader, tremendous leader, he said, "That's a pretty compelling question." And we have to look at that. Do we talk about what we do or what we represent or our company, our brand, whatever, in a way that's disparaging, implying that we wouldn't even buy it?
Hmm.
Are we sitting around commiserating about what we offer and what we do and having blinders on, looking at the problems without saying, yeah, we've got some problems. We're not perfect, but we do deliver. We do care. So that's something that I think is so important. And the bigger the company, the easier it is to get lost in that maze of negativity.
Yeah, it's like the imposter syndrome, like you're not good enough. Like
Hmm.
it's kind of like that as a sociology major, is kind of the group level is kind of the microcosm is infected the macrocosm. So now that same kind of imposter syndrome is like a corporate culture. Like, yeah, we're not that great, and multiple heads in that board were like all saying the same thing.
Hmm.
So it's like it wasn't an individual, it was like a group think, it was a group belief, which might not be true, but maybe they've kind of lost kind of the guidance. They've lost their shine, and now they're kind of stuck in the doldrums. How do you break out of that? Like, well, that's the way it is. It's like, well, yeah, if you're in that, you're not going to get out of it because then you're not going to push, to find where are you doing something that's brilliant? Where are you doing something that, yeah, we do a little boost here and we could make this back to where we were. But if you think, it's not even worth doing it, you're not going to do it.
No, you're right. And I think that what's really important, and we cover this in the book, is that yes, we've discussed that differentiation is critical. Your experience that you offer is critical. The people who are part of what you offer are key to ensuring that you're going to continue offering either new innovations or great service or a wonderful experience. That's what we have to do. And I like to look at it as we're awakening or reawakening the leaders of businesses to make them feel more alive, to make them feel like, God, what we're doing actually is, pretty darn good. We're actually helping people. We're actually doing something that's of value. And it's not just profit and loss or return on investment. It's something even more than that. It's really illustrating to the people that are involved with what you produce that you care and that you are dedicated to making a difference in their lives and the lives of all involved with your product and brand.
So you're kind of like the life coach for the board of directors.
Yeah, I'm kind of the CEO whisperer sometimes because the CEOs can be kind of scary to people, and their employees will go, "Oh boy, I'll tell you, old so and so, he's tough. Oh boy, she's really rough." And they're they're I look at them as humans. They're not these monsters. They're not scary to me. They they have unbelievable pressure coming down on them to perform, to meet the target goal of this amount of profit or market share, whatever it is. It's really hard to do that by yourself, and it's hard to push that chain up a hill. So I try to help them, and I try to have them I try to have them focus their energies on the very few areas, the important areas that they need to really, capitalize on.
I'm just wondering, is the trend like a lot of times people think about corporate America and they think, well, well, what are these guys doing? Well, they lay off, they cut the quality, they change the brand, and I don't like it. So there's kind of like a bad connotation where where do you have it where you maybe you can give a good some good examples of people not just cutting, but people like reinvesting, people connecting and wanting to hear what the people on the floor could offer, rather than
You
saying,
know,
"Well, no, let's cut them out and not have them be involved in the process."
I think it's very easy with the way the media portrays business people and leaders and rich CEOs as these evil and incompetent people, okay, which is it's kind of like Dr. Evil from Austin Powers. It's evil and incompetent. That is a tough combination, I'll tell you. That's
Doctor
a
No,
tough one.
Doctor
Yeah.
No.
And what I look at as I'll tell everybody in the audience 25 years ago, when I would say, look, we want to help you determine your differentiation and then first celebrate it to inspire your people internally, I was laughed out of some boardrooms and I was rejected by probably most of the rest in a nicer way because they said, look, we're paying people $5 an hour. Who cares? They need to keep their head down and perform. I am sharing with you from the bottom of my heart, that's not the way it is today. 9 out of 10 times when I share the same message, you've got to differentiate yourself, show where you're significant and different, and celebrate it first with the people who are behind your product and brand, your employees, as an example. The CEOs have an emotional response that is tearing up in their eyes because that's more important to them than ever. They want their people to be engaged. They want their people to feel proud. They want their people to perform well. So
Mhm.
today, more than I've ever seen in 40 years, the CEO understands it. It's just she or he is under so much pressure that's unreasonable that sometimes it's very difficult for them to see a way out.
Yeah, this seems like a lot of times you're wondering how much investment in the employee, because I've been in business a while, but what I've seen is like sometimes they'll listen to the consultant, outside consultant comes in, but
Yeah.
are they listening to the employees? Are they listening to their own software engineers and architects, or do they bring an outside person in and listen to them and not actually celebrate who's actually been making the product, right? So a lot of times the people on the floor feel like, well, I'm not being valued. There's this outside influence coming in, and they don't feel like they're listened to. And so then there's a disconnect in like how much effort is being made to make there be two-way communication to have understanding, and that can actually help the product if there is a good communication coming from the floor.
That's a great point, and I believe that's happening. I think that's always happened. It's difficult to listen to a chorus of comments and then be able to pick through them and go, you know what, this is really good, and and other times go, no, no, no. So I agree with you. I think it is tough. That's why also a lot of times third party companies will come in and They really don't do a service for the clients because they make it easy for themselves. They'll give you a survey on a scale of 1 to 4. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And that helps. But what I do with our company is I ask the open-ended questions in those surveys. So if a client of ours has 16,300 employees, we will send out surveys with a few numbers, a few, 1 to 4 questions, but we have open-ended questions because we're looking for that unique phrase, that unique word, that message that starts to resonate. And that's what we look for. That's that magic. We look for it and we will find it. I'll tell you, we find it. We look for it. It's in there somewhere and we dig through it. We don't create it, but we're
That's
focused on discovering.
that's really interesting. Because I remember, like, when I went to Bowdoin College, and the whole idea of that is like the blue book. When
Mm-hmm.
you took the exam, you didn't just have multiple choice. You had to show that you understood the course. And
Right.
so the open-ended question is what I'm kind of leading
Yeah.
to. Is if you just have multiple choices, like people kind of get disinterested. You don't know if they're really answering right. But if you allow that open-ended, somebody can actually put in their own words, you're gonna get an opinion, you're gonna get idea. Where if you don't allow that idea to come through, then you've limited the responses. So it's
You're
just, I think
right.
that's really interesting that you have that, like possibility that you won't just get a canned response, that you get
Right.
something that's going to
You're
bubble
right.
up.
I just got a survey yesterday from an organization I'm involved in, and they ask questions, and I knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to make it very easy for themselves to get answers. They were not trying to get into any rich information. And they basically, it was as simple as, oh, do you really, which statement is true? I really love where this organization's going, or I'm very upset with where this organization's going. And I thought, oh, you guys, come on. You're putting me in a position that's ridiculous. You don't want my information. You want to just get me away and out of your system so that you can just say, hey, we ask a lot of people. What you said's right. If we truly want to learn, we have to listen and we have to give our people the chance to express themselves, not in our words, but in their words.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the things being in political science, in any of the you learn how to take surveys. You learned how to do statistics, and you learn, like, if I craft, I was taught how to craft a survey,
Yeah,
and I can craft that survey to give me what I want.
right,
So, like, if I could craft all those questions to give me exactly the kind of answers I want,
right,
or I could be more honest and say, well, I'm going to go look for some things I don't want. May
right.
want to see what's going to happen, be a real researcher and actually see what's really out there versus I want to have a specific response because I'm looking to be able to push a certain number that I can go say, oh, look, I proved this point because I'm trying to prove my point.
Right. Vulnerability. That's what it's all about. If you want to succeed, you have to be vulnerable. You have to say, look, I hate some of these comments that I'm getting. Oh my gosh, I hate them. But I can learn from it. And you know what? We'll be better for it, but boy, do I hate seeing some of these comments. If you're willing to be that vulnerable, you're going to be successful.
Yeah, I think the vulnerability, has always been a core theme. What I've talked about is like because you feel real, you feel honest, you don't feel like you're just been kind of overly scripted. Like the reason why I do a live podcast because I don't want to go and get all the ums out of it. I don't want
Right.
to go and edit it down, put fancy music, put all these effects, and do all these things. It's like no, I want to have a real conversation with an individual to get to their point
Right.
what they have to offer because it's like a master class. You're given a master class on what you do. So I'll let you say it.
You're right. That's exactly, I couldn't put it any better. I think that's right on target.
So one of the things I like to ask people before we let them go, because we always end up being, hitting the hour mark before we ever expect it is like, are there three things about yourself that people would find like very interesting they wouldn't initially perceive that you can maybe tell the audience?
Um, well, one thing I did talk about is my background in music. So I've written hundreds of songs. I've written rock operas. I have a band called Mark, M-A-R-K, Urgent, which is on Spotify and a million other platforms. So there's a lot of songs out there. So that's number one. Number two, I've written a dozen parable books, not terrible with a T, but with parable with a P, that are on business, that were very expressive. Number three is when my children were growing up, and this really helped me with my leadership style, I coached them in baseball and basketball. And I was more of a cheerleader than a brilliant strategist out there, but it helped guide the way I work with people and how I could see in those children, this one had this talent, this one had that. We nicknamed each one of the children so that they all had their own identity, and it was positive nicknames, by the way, but they all had nicknames. And at the end of each season, whether we won more games or lost more games, it had no bearing. We had a huge celebration, and each child was brought up, and we all talked. All the kids on the team and the coaches talked about what that child did great. And to me, that inspired me to run a business and to also help clients identify what they do so well. Basically, differentiation.
Yeah, differentiation. I like the way you came to that, but with that kind of a more positive reinforcement rather than negative reinforcement. Which I think is like everybody thinks they kind of have to lord over people, kind of do the negative thing and like say, "Oh, red mark everything."
Right.
Like if you have the teacher that red marked you, you probably dread going to the class.
Right.
But if you had the teacher that inspired you so much that every day you went to the class, you were like you wanted to be in that seat. And when I was going to school, the teachers and professors that made me want to be in the class, I did better
Oh, yeah.
than the teachers that wanted to show me how much better they were than me. I was like, "Well, you're the professor, so I guess you of course you're gonna know more than me."
You're right. You're right. I had a teacher I really liked, but he told me, give up. You can't succeed. But then I had another teacher that said, you know what? You can do anything you put your mind to. And then you have to choose. You got to choose who you listen to.
Yeah, is this cool that when you have people that help, you run into people and you have to learn how to deal with it. But it's always really positive story when you hear that positive reinforcement that you're talking about in a differentiation instead of like looking at, oh, what do we got to cut? What do we got to drop? Instead of like, what am I good at? That's usually not where people start. They want to, like we'll find out like, oh, I'm terrible at this and I'm not good at that. And like having to find in that thing that you can celebrate, like you were talking about with the employees before, that you actually find that. I think that's so positive. And that's a different outlook that maybe people don't expect. But it's good to hear that businesses are going in the trend that we've been talking about. But I want to thank you again for being on the podcast and remind everyone that we got www.barrylabov.com. That's fully clickable. We were published, and we were just on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch, and we'll be on all the major platforms that you can listen to or watch a podcast by tomorrow. Thank you for being a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast.
I'll tell you, I love your show. Thank you so much. Your passion and your creativity shines through the entire podcast. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Have a good night. Have a good weekend.
Hey, you bet. Take care.